Welcome to our deep dive into Gilles Deleuze's Difference and Repetition. This is considered one of the most challenging and rewarding works of 20th century philosophy, and today we'll be attempting to unpack the core concepts of this dense but brilliant text.
Deleuze's work often feels like a deliberate provocation to the history of Western philosophy, particularly its tendency to prioritize identity and sameness.
And nowhere is this provocation more evident than in his concept of repetition, which, it just seems to contradict our common sense understanding of the term.
Precisely. We tend to think of repetition as, the recurrence of the same, a predictable cycle governed by general laws. But Deleuze wants to disentangle repetition from this association with sameness and reveal its potential as a generative force, a principle of difference, selection, creation, and even destruction.
So how can something that seems to be about the return of the same be a source of difference?
Deleuze argues that true repetition is never a simple mechanical reproduction. Rather, it's always a repetition with a difference, a repetition that introduces something new into the world. Think of a musical theme that recurs throughout a composition. Each repetition is not merely a copy of the first instance. It's modulated, varied, placed in a new context, creating a difference that generates meaning and effect.
So the repetition isn't about the identity of the notes themselves, but about the differences created through their arrangement and recurrence.
Exactly, and this principle extends beyond music to all aspects of being. Deleuze sees repetition as the driving force behind evolution, learning, even the formation of the self. Each repetition is an opportunity for divergence, for the emergence of novelty and complexity.
This brings us to one of the most significant challenges Deleuze poses to traditional philosophy, his critique of representation.
For Deleuze, the philosophical tradition, from Plato to Kant, has been dominated by a representational model of thought. This model seeks to explain the world in terms of pre-existing categories, identities, and essences. Difference is always understood as a deviation from a pre-given model, a kind of negative image of the same.
So instead of seeing difference as fundamental, it's always subordinate to identity, a mere variation on a theme.
Exactly. And this, for Deleuze, is a profound mistake. He argues that difference is not a secondary phenomenon, but rather the primary condition of possibility for identity, thought, and being itself.
This suggests a radical inversion of traditional philosophical hierarchies.
Absolutely. To understand Deleuze's position, it's helpful to look at the philosophical lineage he draws upon. Thinkers like Duns Scotus and Spinoza offer an alternative to the representational model, one that embraces the concept of univocal being.
Can you unpack this concept of univocal being for us?
In contrast to the traditional view, which posits a hierarchy of being with God at the pinnacle, univocal being asserts that being is said in the same way of all things. There are no degrees of being, no higher or lower forms. God, humans, animals, and even inanimate objects all participate in being equally.
So there's no ontological distinction between creator and created, no privileging of the human perspective.
Precisely. And this has profound implications for how we understand difference. If being is univocal, then difference can no longer be seen as a negation or lack of being, instead becomes the very condition for individuation and the emergence of the new.
This aligns with Deleuze's emphasis on difference as a positive and generative force.
Exactly. And it's here that Spinoza's influence becomes particularly significant. Spinoza develops a sophisticated philosophy of immanence, where everything that exists is part of a single, interconnected substance. Difference, in this context, is not something that separates, but rather something that connects, creating a dynamic interplay of forces within this unified field of being.
This resonates with Deleuze's idea of the virtual, a realm of pure potentiality that pre-exists the actual.
Precisely. The virtual is not a separate realm, but rather a dimension of the actual, constantly unfolding and differentiating itself through the force of intensity.
And this concept of intensity seems crucial for understanding how Deleuze bridges the gap between the virtual and the actual.
Intensity is the driving force of actualization. It's the pressure, the energy that pushes the virtual to differentiate itself, to take on concrete form, to become actual.
But how does this process actually unfold? How does intensity give rise to the diversity and complexity of the world we experience?
Deleuze draws on a wide range of sources, from thermodynamics and embryology to calculus and chaos theory, to develop his account of actualization. One way to grasp this process is to consider his example of the embryo. The embryo starts as a single cell, with a vast potential for differentiation. It's through the interplay of intensive forces that this potential is actualized, giving rise to the diverse tissues and organs that constitute the organism.
So intensity functions like a catalyst, driving the process of individuation and differentiation.
Precisely. And this process isn't limited to the biological realm. Deleuze sees intensity operating in all domains of being, from the formation of geological formations to the emergence of social structures.
This raises the question of how this concept of intensity relates to our experience of time.
Deleuze's understanding of time is inextricably linked to his concepts of repetition and intensity. He rejects the traditional linear model of time, where the past is a fixed point and the present a fleeting moment. Instead, he proposes a threefold synthesis of time, which he terms the passive syntheses.
These passive syntheses are crucial for understanding how Deleuze rethinks the relationship between past, present, and future.
Absolutely. The first passive synthesis, the synthesis of habit, is about the way the past is contracted into the present. Our habits, our expectations, our very bodily dispositions are formed through the accumulation and sedimentation of past experiences.
So the past isn't something static and gone. It's actively shaping our present through the force of habit.
Precisely. And this leads to the second passive synthesis, the synthesis of memory. Here, the past is not simply repeated, but actively haunts the present. It's not about conscious recollection, but about the way the past erupts into our present experience, coloring our perceptions and influencing our actions.
So the past isn't just something we remember, it's something that actively shapes who we are in the present.
Exactly. And this brings us to the third passive synthesis, the synthesis of the eternal return. This is where Deleuze's concept of repetition takes on its most radical dimension.
Because here he connects repetition to Nietzsche's idea of the eternal return, but gives it his own unique spin.
For Deleuze, the eternal return is not about the literal recurrence of the same events. It's about the affirmation of difference, the affirmation of the creative power of repetition itself. It's the idea that each moment, each event, is pregnant with infinite possibilities, and that repetition is the process by which these possibilities are actualized.
So the eternal return isn't a fatalistic doctrine of endless cycles, but rather an affirmation of the inexhaustible potential for novelty and becoming.
Precisely. And this brings us back to Deleuze's concept of difference. The eternal return is the affirmation of difference as the primary principle of reality. It's the recognition that the universe is not a closed system governed by fixed laws, but an open and dynamic process of continuous creation and differentiation.
This challenges us to rethink our understanding of ourselves and the world around us. If difference is truly primary, if repetition is the engine of becoming, what does this mean for our notions of identity, causality, and even the nature of reality itself?
These are the questions that Deleuze's philosophy compels us to confront. It's a philosophy that demands we abandon our comfortable assumptions and embrace the unsettling, exhilarating truth of a universe in perpetual flux, driven by the inexhaustible power of difference and repetition.
Indeed, Deleuze's work opens up a vast and complex terrain for exploration, and we've only just begun to scratch the surface. There's much more to unpack, to analyze, and to grapple with as we delve deeper into difference and repetition.
In our next segment, we'll explore how Deleuze further develops his critique of representation through his analysis of the concept of the idea.
Stay with us as we continue our deep dive into the thought of one of the most challenging and rewarding philosophers of our time. Let's turn now to Deleuze's radical reinterpretation of the philosophical concept of the idea.
Traditionally, the idea has been conceived as, well, a static and eternal form representing the essence of a thing. Plato's forms, for instance. They exist in this transcendent realm, serving as these perfect models that worldly objects imperfectly imitate.
So the idea is seen as a blueprint, a pre-existing structure that determines the nature of reality.
Yeah, Deleuze really challenges this static and representational view of the idea. For him, the idea is not a fixed form, but a dynamic process, a multiplicity.
This term, multiplicity, it seems pretty crucial to Deleuze's project. Could you elaborate on what he means by it?
A multiplicity? Well, it's not a single thing, nor a collection of multiple things. It's a complex structure, composed of differential elements, relations, and singularities. These elements are not pre-given, but emerge through a process of differentiation, driven by intensity.
So instead of a static blueprint, the idea is more like a dynamic system, constantly evolving and differentiating itself.
Precisely. And this dynamic nature of the idea is what connects it to Deleuze's concept of difference. The idea is not a representation of something else, but a process of differentiation, a becoming.
This challenges the traditional distinction between the idea as a mental representation and the object it represents.
For Deleuze, the idea is not separate from the world, but immanent to it. It's not a model that pre-exists reality, but a force that generates and shapes it.
This brings to mind Deleuze's concept of the virtual,
Yeah.
a realm of pure potentiality that's actualized through the force of intensity.
hmm The virtual is the realm of ideas, a field of pre-individual singularities and differential relations. It's not a separate realm, but a dimension of the actual constantly unfolding and differentiating itself.
So the idea as a multiplicity exists in this virtual realm and is actualized through the process of differentiation.
Deleuze uses the term dramatization to describe this process of actualization. It's not a simple unfolding, but a complex interplay of forces, a performance, if you will, in which the virtual differentiates itself into the actual.
This term, dramatization, it really suggests a dynamic and even theatrical element to this process.
Deleuze emphasizes that this dramatization is not directed or predetermined. It's a creative and emergent process, driven by the force of intensity.
So the idea, as a virtual multiplicity, is dramatized through the force of intensity, giving rise to the actual world we experience.
Deleuze draws on the example of embryology to illustrate this process. The embryo starts as a single cell, a totipotent entity containing the virtual potential for all the different cell types and organs that will constitute the organism.
This initial totipotency is reminiscent of the virtual realm, a field of pure potentiality.
Right. The development of the embryo is a process of dramatization. Driven by the interplay of intensive forces within the cellular environment, these forces guide the differentiation of cells, the formation of tissues, and ultimately the emergence of the organism.
So the embryo's development is not a simple unfolding of a pre-existing plan, but an emergent process of differentiation driven by intensity.
This process of dramatization, it extends beyond the biological realm. Deleuze sees it operating in all domains of being, from the formation of geological structures to the emergence of social and cultural formations.
This suggests a fundamental shift in how we understand causality and determination. Instead of linear chains of cause and effect, we have a complex interplay of intensive forces driving the emergence of novelty and difference.
Deleuze's account of the idea as a multiplicity challenges us to rethink the nature of knowledge and understanding. We can no longer grasp reality through static concepts and categories. Instead, we must engage with the dynamic and open-ended process of becoming.
This implies a more fluid and experimental approach to thought, one that embraces difference and the unpredictable nature of becoming.
Deleuze's philosophy invites us to think differently, to move beyond the constraints of representation, to embrace the creative power of difference. It's a philosophy that resonates with contemporary developments in science, art, and culture, where the emphasis on complexity, emergence, and self-organization is becoming increasingly prominent.
Deleuze's project demands a radical reorientation of our thinking, a shift from a static and representational model to a dynamic and processual one. It's a challenge that requires us to rethink the fundamental categories of our thought and to embrace the creative potential of difference and repetition.
To further understand how this reconceptualization of the idea operates, we need to examine Deleuze's concept of the three syntheses of time.
These syntheses seem crucial for understanding how Deleuze reconfigures the relationship between past, present, and future.
The three syntheses of time. Well, they offer a way to understand how the virtual realm of ideas is woven into the fabric of our lived experience, shaping our perceptions, our memories, and our very sense of self.
Let's delve into these syntheses then, beginning with the first synthesis, which Deleuze calls the synthesis of habit.
The synthesis of habit is the foundation upon which our experience of time is built. It's the process by which the past is contracted into the present, forming the ground of our perceptions and actions.
So it's through habit that the past, rather than being something gone and static, actively shapes our present experience.
Precisely. Our habits, both physical and mental, they're formed through the repetition of past actions and experiences. These repetitions leave traces, creating patterns and dispositions that shape our present responses to the world.
This suggests that even our most immediate perceptions are infused with the weight of the past.
Deleuze argues that the synthesis of habit is not simply a matter of conscious learning or conditioning. It operates at a deeper preconscious level, shaping our bodily rhythms, our affective responses, and our very sense of self.
So habit is not just about repeating actions. It's about the formation of a pre-reflective ground that structures our entire being in the world.
The synthesis of habit is the first step in the constitution of the self, the foundation upon which our temporal experience is built. It's the ground from which the other two syntheses emerge.
Let's move on then to the second synthesis of time, the synthesis of memory.
The synthesis of memory goes beyond the simple repetition of the past. It involves the active recollection and re-experiencing of past events.
So this is where conscious recollection comes into play, our ability to recall specific events and experiences from the past.
However, for Deleuze, memory is not simply a passive repository of past events. It's an active force that shapes our present experience.
This echoes your earlier point about the past haunting the present.
Precisely. The synthesis of memory is about the way the past erupts into our present, shaping our perceptions, our emotions, and our understanding of ourselves.
So memory is not simply about retrieving information. It's about the way the past continues to resonate and exert a force on our present.
Deleuze emphasizes that memory is not limited to conscious recollection. It also operates at a pre-conscious level, influencing our dreams, our fantasies, and our creative expressions.
This suggests that the past is not something we can simply leave behind. It's woven into the fabric of our being, shaping us in ways we may not even be aware of.
The synthesis of memory is a key element in the constitution of the self. It's through memory that we develop a sense of personal identity, a narrative that connects our past, present, and future.
This understanding of memory challenges the traditional view of the self as a stable and unified entity. Instead, it suggests a more fluid and dynamic conception of selfhood, one that's constantly being shaped and reshaped by the forces of memory.
The synthesis of memory, like the synthesis of habit, is a passive synthesis. It operates at a pre-reflective level, shaping our experience without our conscious control.
This brings us to the third and final synthesis of time, the synthesis of the eternal return, which you mentioned earlier is perhaps the most radical and challenging of Deleuze's temporal syntheses.
The synthesis of the eternal return, it marks a radical departure from traditional conceptions of time. It's not about, the cyclical recurrence of the same events, but about the affirmation of difference as the very ground of being.
That seems kind of paradoxical. How can the eternal return, which is often associated with endless repetition, be connected to the affirmation of difference?
Deleuze's interpretation of the eternal return draws heavily on Nietzsche, but he gives it a distinctive twist. For Deleuze, the eternal return is not a doctrine of cosmic recurrence, but an ontological principle. It's the affirmation that being is not fixed or static, but eternally differentiating itself.
So it's not about the same things happening over and over again, but about the eternal potential for difference and novelty inherent in being itself.
Precisely. The eternal return is the affirmation of the inexhaustible power of difference to generate new and unexpected forms. It's the recognition that every moment, every event is pregnant with, infinite possibilities.
This suggests a profound shift in our understanding of time and causality. Instead of a linear progression from past to present to future, we have an eternal play of forces, a constant becoming that's never exhausted.
The synthesis of the eternal return challenges us to think beyond the limitations of linear time and embrace the dynamism of a universe in constant flux. It's a perspective that dissolves the boundaries between past, present, and future, revealing their interpenetration and mutual constitution.
This seems to connect to Deleuze's concept of the unconscious as a field of entities, constantly driving the process of differentiation.
The unconscious, for Deleuze, is not a repository of repressed desires and traumas, but a dynamic and creative force. It's a realm of virtual intensities, constantly pushing for actualization and differentiation.
So the unconscious is not about lack or negativity, but about an abundance of creative potential.
Precisely. Deleuze unconscious is not structured like a language, with hidden meanings and symbolic representations. It's a pre-linguistic realm of forces and flows, a chaotic and generative flux.
This challenges traditional psychoanalytic approaches that focus on interpreting the unconscious through the lens of language and symbolism.
For Deleuze, the unconscious expresses itself not through language, but through repetition. However, this repetition is not a simple mechanical recurrence, but a repetition with a difference, a repetition that introduces novelty and variation.
This brings us back to Deleuze's central insight, that repetition is not about sameness, but about difference and creation.
The unconscious, through its repetitions, constantly generates new connections, new assemblages, new possibilities for thought and action. It's the engine of becoming, the source of our creativity and dynamism.
This suggests that our conscious experience is just the tip of the iceberg, a surface manifestation of a vast and dynamic unconscious realm.
Deleuze's philosophy, it invites us to delve into this unconscious realm, not to decipher its hidden meanings, but to tap into its creative potential. It's a call to embrace the chaos and flux of becoming, to become active participants in the eternal play of difference and repetition.
Deleuze's difference and repetition presents a dense and challenging but ultimately exhilarating vision of a universe driven by the inexhaustible power of difference. It's a philosophy that calls for a radical reorientation of our thinking, an embrace of the dynamism and creativity inherent in the very fabric of being.
His work provides us with a new set of conceptual tools for navigating the complexities of a world increasingly characterized by flux, uncertainty, and rapid transformation. It's a philosophy that's as relevant today as it was when it was first published, offering us a way to understand and embrace the challenges and possibilities of our time.
Deleuze's challenge to traditional philosophical categories, and his affirmation of difference as the driving force of becoming, well, they leave us with much to ponder. His work invites us to rethink our assumptions about identity, causality, and even the nature of reality itself.
It's a philosophy that demands careful study and sustained engagement, but the rewards are immense. Deleuze offers us a way to see the world anew, to appreciate the beauty and complexity of a universe in constant creation.
As we conclude our deep dive into difference and repetition, we invite you, our listeners, to continue exploring Deleuze's thought. Engage with his challenging ideas, grapple with his complex concepts, and allow his philosophy to transform your understanding of yourselves and the world around you.
Remember, difference is not something to be feared or suppressed. It's the very source of life, creativity, and becoming. Embrace the power of difference and let it guide you on your own unique journey of philosophical exploration.